Hi guys, and welcome to Calm Night Radio channel. Tonight we slip into the damp grey morning of an 1840 plantation kitchen yard and ask a hard, unsettling question. How do you keep a human body moving when the food is never quite enough, never quite yours, and never offered with mercy? You stand in the faint blue light before sunrise, where the air smells of wet earth, ashes, and old smoke, and where survival is measured in handfuls of cornmeal and strips of salt pork. So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And while you are here, comment below with your location and local time. Now, dim the lights, and let yourself enter a place where the rooster calls too early. The ground chills your bare feet, and the first thought of the day is not comfort, but food. You stand outside a row of rough cabins while the morning mist still clings to the fields. The light is weak and silvery, pine smoke drifts low and slow. Somewhere close by, a baby fusses, a cough rises from one doorway, and an iron pot lid clinks against stone. The plantation is waking, though it never really slept, even before the sun clears the horizon. People are already measuring the day against their strength. Strength means labour. Labour means calories. And calories in this place arrive in small, coarse, controlled portions. The weekly ration is the centre of that calculation. It is simple on paper, if paper can ever describe hunger properly. On many plantations in the American South around 1840, enslaved adults were commonly issued cornmeal and pork, sometimes a little molasses, sometimes herring, sometimes nothing extra at all. The quantity varied by region, by crop, by season, and by the choices of the enslaver, which is a delicate way of saying it varied according to someone else's greed. One common allotment might be a peck of cornmeal for the week and several pounds of salt pork, enough to keep a person alive, perhaps, enough to make labour profitable, enough to avoid total collapse most of the time, but comfort, not remotely. You can almost feel the texture of that cornmeal in your hands. It is pale, gritty, and dry, with a faint dusty smell. It clings to your fingers and settles in the creases of your skin. Cornmeal is cheap, filling, and stubborn. It can become mush, ash cakes, hoe cakes, pone, or porridge. It can be boiled into something soft enough for old people with weak teeth, or packed and baked into something dense enough to carry into the fields. It is not glamorous. No one would mistake it for abundance. But it is dependable in the harshest sense of the word. You can survive on it for a while. That was precisely why it was given. Then there is the pork. Salted hard, streaked with fat, sometimes rank at the edges, sometimes already beginning to turn in the heat if not handled carefully. It smells sharp and sour before cooking, then rich and almost intoxicating once it hits the fire. That smell matters. When food is scarce, the smell alone can stir up hope. A small piece of salt pork, chopped and rendered, can season an entire pot of cornmeal or greens. The fat becomes precious. Nothing is wasted, not the drippings, not the rind, not the bones. A modern cook might fuss over presentation. Here, grease itself is a treasure. You watch a woman squat near the hearth, her movements practised and economical. She tips meal into a wooden bowl, adds a little water, and stirs with her hand. The sound is soft and thick. A child waits beside her, silent in that patient way children learn when patience is not optional. She pinches off a portion of dough and presses it flat. Soon it will meet a hot surface, and the smell will rise, warm and faintly sweet, into the cabin. The cake will be coarse and heavy. It will fill the stomach for a few hours. That is the point. Plantation food is designed for endurance, not delight. Still, delight finds odd little openings. It always does. A bit of molasses, if available, changes everything for a moment. Dark, sticky, and fragrant. It brings a burnt sweetness that can soften the blunt edge of plain meal. Children would have noticed that immediately. So would adults, though perhaps more quietly. There is a fringe account from the period that suggests some enslaved people would treasure even the crusted residue of syrup barrels, scraping sweetness from wood the way others might scrape gold from rock. Historians cannot always verify every such anecdote, but it fits the larger truth. When your diet is repetitive and sparse, any small variation becomes memorable. The plantation yard around you is full of these tiny negotiations. A ration is never just a ration. It has to be stretched, guarded, traded, hidden, cooked, and sometimes defended. You hear low voices speaking over one another. There is no theatrical misery here, no dramatic music, no grand speech, just the ordinary pressure of making too little food last too long. A man checks a sack, lifts it, judges its weight, and says nothing. Another person cuts pork into strict portions, her knife tapping the board in a steady beat. There is skill in this, real skill, quiet arithmetic, and yet the arithmetic never stops being cruel. Field labour in 1840 demanded enormous energy. Cotton, sugar, rice, and tobacco work consumed the body in different ways, but all of it was punishing. Long hours under heat, constant bending, lifting, chopping, hauling, planting, hoeing. You need fuel for that. Real fuel, protein, fats, enough carbohydrates to replace what the muscles burn. Enslavers often claimed their workers were adequately fed, a statement that sounds almost comic until you remember it was used to defend a brutal system. Adequate for profit is not the same as adequate for health. Many people on plantations suffered from nutritional deficiencies, especially when rations shrank or when supplies were poor in quality. Salt pork offered fat and some protein. Yes, but fresh foods could be scarce, especially under tight control. Cornmeal filled the belly, but it did not solve everything. A diet heavily dependent on corn without proper processing could contribute to illness. Historians still argue how widespread certain deficiency diseases were from region to region, since records were patchy and often filtered through the eyes of slaveholders, physicians, or visitors who noticed some suffering and ignored other parts. But no serious reading of the evidence suggests abundance. The body paid a price. You feel that price in the rhythm of the morning. People do not move lazily. They move with discipline because wasted effort costs too much. The cabin floor is cool underfoot. The fire throws a mild heat against your shins while your back still feels the dawn chill. Smoke stings the eyes. The smell of pork grease settles into hair, clothes, wood, blankets, everything. It never quite leaves. Even outside, the scent follows. It mixes with clay, sweat, and damp leaves. This is the atmosphere of survival. Not a feast, not a famine scene painted for pity, but a daily, grinding middle ground where hunger hovers close, and hunger had levels. There is the sharp hunger of an empty stomach. Then there is the slower hunger of repetition, when the mouth is tired of the same texture, the same taste, the same heavy paste of meal and fat. Then there is the hidden hunger, the kind that gnaws at the body even after eating because the food is not enough in kind, not just quantity. That kind is more difficult to dramatize. It does not always make a scene. It just weakens people, little by little. You might think the ration day itself would feel hopeful. Sometimes it probably did. Food arriving means possibility, but it also brings worry. Will it last? Is the pork too spoiled? Has the measure been cut short? Did someone in the household already need extra because they are ill, pregnant, nursing, old, or growing fast? Even children understood the tension. They could read adults' faces. They knew when the sack looked thin. Inside the cabins, tools for turning ration into meals are humble but effective. A pot blackened by years of use, a skillet with a warped handle, wooden bowls smooth from repetition, stones near the hearth, bits of cloth, a barrel or storage box if the household is lucky enough to keep one. The genius is not in fancy equipment. It is in practiced hands. One person knows how much water the meal can take before it loses shape. Another can judge the fire by scent and sound, not sight. A third can make a little grease carry through a whole pan. Sleepy brilliance! You see one older man crumble cornbread into a bowl and pour hot liquid over it, making a kind of quick meal that softens stale food and wastes nothing. Another person fries a cake hard so it can travel better. Someone saves drippings in a tin. Someone else tucks meal away from rats. There is always a contest against spoilage, vermin, theft, weather, and time. Plantation food is not just eaten. It is managed like a fragile supply line. There is also social meaning in the ration yard. Distribution is control made visible. The enslaver or overseer may not need to shout. The system shouts for them. Food comes from power, through power, and under power. You are meant to understand that your appetite belongs to someone else's ledger. That is part of the cruelty. A person's life is reduced to a cost of maintenance. Not a soul, not a family member, not a mind with preferences and memories. A unit of labour that must be fed just enough to continue. But human beings never stay units for long. They keep becoming themselves. That is the stubborn fact of this whole landscape. Even in the ration line, you would see style, preference, judgment. Someone favours a thinner mush, someone a firmer cake. One cook chars the edges on purpose because the bitterness brings interest. Another saves the fattest pork for children, or for the person working the hardest task. Someone pinches off a tiny warm piece and gives it to a child before daylight labour begins. Tiny rebellion, tiny mercy. There were also differences among plantations, and that matters. Some enslaved people received slightly more varied food. Coastal areas might include fish. Some places offered sweet potatoes or peas more regularly. Others were harsher, leaner, more monotonous. A traveller in one county might report people receiving decent pork and meal, while another observer elsewhere would describe near starvation. The South was not one giant kitchen with one recipe. It was a patchwork of local ecologies and local tyrannies. Still, the broad pattern holds. Basic rations were the backbone, and they were rarely generous. Listen closely and the yard gives you a whole soundtrack. Crackle of kindling, a low murmur, a slap of dough against palm, a spoon scraping a pot, a pig grunting in the distance, almost insulting in its future abundance, crows calling from the trees, then the first louder sounds of command from farther off. The day is beginning in earnest. People eat quickly now, or carry what they can. Food has to fit labour's timetable, not the body's wishes. The taste of the meal, when you imagine it properly, is plain and heavy, a little smoky if cooked near open flame, perhaps slightly sour if the meal is old, perhaps richer if grease was spared. The salt pork is intense, almost aggressive, especially to a mouth that has known little seasoning beyond salt and smoke. Salt burns on cracked lips. Grease coats the tongue. Corn sits thick in the stomach. It is crude fuel, but fuel all the same. And fuel was the line between motion and collapse. That is the sober truth at the centre of this quiet dawn. People stayed alive on plantation food in 1840 because they learned every possible use of every rationed scrap. They read weight by hand, judged heat by instinct, and turned monotony into endurance. Not because the system cared whether they thrived. It did not. They survived because they had knowledge, discipline, and a painful intimacy with scarcity. So as the sun finally lifts and the mist loosens from the ground, you remain in that yard for one last moment. Smoke curls upward. The cakes are done. The meal is portioned. The pork is cut. The day presses forward. And before any hoe strikes dirt, before any basket is lifted, before any command lands in the air, survival has already begun in the hand that stirs cornmeal and the nose that catches the scent of precious grease in the pan. The cabin yard is still cool when you step behind the main row of dwellings and notice that the land changes character almost at once. The packed earth near the doors gives way to softer soil, darker in places, crumbly in others, marked by careful hands instead of wagon wheels. A few narrow plots lie tucked between fence lines, tree roots, and scraps of open ground. They are not grand gardens. No one would mistake them for ornamental beds. Yet these rough patches carry a different kind of power. The air smells of damp leaves, turned dirt, and something green crushed underfoot. A hoe blade knocks against a stone. Somewhere close. Someone pulls weeds with a quick, tearing sound. This is where bare rations meet imagination. You crouch near one little patch and see rows that are almost shy in their size. Beans climb a crude support of sticks. Mustard greens spread low and lively. A few onion tops lift from the earth like thin green brushes. Beyond them, there may be cowpeas, perhaps some squash, maybe sweet potatoes if the soil and season allow. The shapes are modest, but the intention is immense. Each plant promises relief from sameness. each leaf, root, and pod says that a life cannot be maintained on cornmeal and pork alone without consequence. Even a few extra mouthfuls of fresh food matter more than they seem. These provision plots were often cultivated during the slivers of time left after plantation labour. That sentence sounds calm on the page. In reality, it means people worked brutally long days and then came home to work again. The body must have protested. The feet would ache, the shoulders would burn, fingers would stiffen from hoe handles and heavy loads. Still, many families planted. They planted because hunger did not respect exhaustion. They planted because a little patch could mean fewer empty feelings in the stomach, fewer weak afternoons, fewer children going to sleep with nothing but starch. You can feel the soil between your fingers now. It's cool and grainy near the surface, moist an inch below. It holds the smell of rain from several days ago. Someone has mounded certain rows carefully, which suggests experience. A person who knows roots need room. A person who has watched what thrives in heat, what rots in wet weather, what survives neglect for just a few days when labour demands become crushing. Gardening here is not leisure, it is strategy. There is also an intimate beauty in the arrangement. Greens nearest the cabin for easy cutting. Beans placed where they can climb and save space. Herbs near the doorway, perhaps because they are useful in cooking or because someone likes brushing them with a skirt and smelling them release their sharpness. You catch the clean peppery scent of mustard leaf, then the sweeter smell of onion when one is pulled and shaken. That little breath of freshness cuts through the heavier odours of smoke and grease drifting from the cabins. It feels almost medicinal. Many enslaved families in 1840 depended on such plots to supplement meagre rations. This was especially true where enslavers allowed small garden spaces, whether from calculation, custom, or plain convenience. A garden could reduce the burden of feeding the labour force fully. Imagine the generosity of that arrangement. If you enjoy dark humour, a person is underfed, overworked, denied freedom, and then expected to solve part of the food problem personally in spare hours. And yet people did solve it again and again, because surviving often means mastering a problem you did not create. The crops themselves varied by region, climate, and available seed. In many southern plantations, people grew collards, turnips, peas, cabbage, pumpkins, sweet potatoes, and field peas. Some cultivated okra, some kept peppers for heat and flavour. In places where African food traditions remained strong, certain plants and preparation habits endured with remarkable persistence. Okra is an especially famous example, and not by accident. It thickens stews, produces generously, and handles hot weather with an almost smug confidence. A plant like that earns respect quickly. You see a woman cut a handful of greens with a quick twist of the wrist. She chooses the outer leaves and leaves the centre alive so the plant can keep giving. That is knowledge learned through repetition. Beside her, a child gathers fallen twigs for a cooking fire, then pauses to dig a finger into the dirt near a sweet potato mound, perhaps hoping to feel the hidden shape beneath. The child is corrected softly. Not yet. Timing matters. Pull too early and you lose size. Wait too long and something else may get there first, whether worm, weather, or hungry hand. These gardens also carried private meaning. In a world structured by theft, tending a plant from seed to harvest offered a rare form of authorship. You place something in the ground. You watch it rise. You know its habits. You judge its readiness. The harvest may still be constrained by hunger, by surveillance, by demands from others, but the act itself belongs more closely to you than the vast surrounding field ever could. Cotton rows do not love you back. A cabbage might not either, but it at least answers attention. Some plots likely held plants chosen for practicality above all else. Sweet potatoes were particularly valuable. They are filling, versatile, and easier on the body than a diet made of almost pure cornmeal. Roasted in coals, boiled in a pot, sliced into stews, or simply eaten warm from the skin, they offer sweetness and comfort at once. Their smell when cooking is one of the gentlest scents in the yard, earthy and sugary, with a softness that seems nearly luxurious in such a hard place. You break one open in your mind and watch steam rise from the orange flesh. Even a small one feels like a gift. Greens mattered too, and perhaps more than people with full kitchens might guess. Collards, turnip greens, mustard, and poke in some cases brought vitamins and freshness that ration food lacked. Cooked low and slow with a scrap of pork, they could transform a meal from blunt fuel into something that revived the whole mouth. The leaves soften, the pot liquor turns savoury and rich. Salt, smoke, and bitterness mingle. You sip that broth and feel the body wake a little. Not cured, not restored to easy health, but helped. Historians still debate the exact degree of autonomy people had in these garden spaces on different plantations, because the evidence is uneven and often indirect. Some accounts suggest meaningful independence in managing plots and sometimes selling surplus produce. Others describe tighter restrictions and little reliable access to land. Both can be true. Plantation systems differed widely. What remains clear is that wherever such patches existed, they could become critical to nutrition and morale. You notice that gardens invite conversation differently from ration yards. Here, people exchange practical remarks. Which seed took best? Which row needs ash for pests? Which vine is failing? Which leaves are ready today? The voices are low and steady, more companionable than dramatic. Hands keep moving while mouths speak. A grandmother points with her chin rather than wasting motion. An older boy carries a bucket of water and sloshes half of it onto his own feet. No one laughs much, but one person does smile, a small thing. Still a real thing. There are quirky details hidden in this world too. Some observers from the era recorded enslaved gardeners using broken pottery, old gourds, and even odd bits of bone around plantings, whether as markers, makeshift tools, or practical debris reused because nothing useful was ever thrown away. It gives the garden a patched, inventive look. One row begins near a cracked bowl half buried in the ground. Another ends at a stake that may once have been part of a chair. The whole place looks assembled from need and persistence. A small patch of herbs changes the atmosphere again. Mint, maybe, or pennyroyal, perhaps. Maybe sage if someone managed to keep it going. Herb seasoned food, yes, but they also blur the line between kitchen and care. A leaf can flavour peas, a sprig can scent wash water, a brew can soothe stomach trouble or a cold. On plantations, the separation between food and medicine was often thin because the body had to make use of every plant it could trust. You rub a leaf between your fingers and smell the release, sharp and bright in the morning air. It feels like a secret too strong for the place around it. You also cannot ignore the danger of scarcity within the garden itself. A tiny plot is vulnerable. A dry spell can harden the ground like brick. Heavy rain can flatten tender shoots. Chickens scratch where they should not. Hogs are worse. A hungry person may borrow produce without asking because hunger is an impatient negotiator. Then there is simple fatigue. Plants do not pause their needs because the worker is worn out. Weeds rise anyway. Bugs arrive anyway. The garden asks for care with almost indecent confidence. Still, you keep seeing evidence of determination. The mounded rows, the tied bean poles, the saved seeds drying on a cloth. That last one matters. To save seed is to think beyond the next meal. It is an act of planning, almost of faith. A pod is not just food, it is future food. A pepper is not only a pepper, it is next season waiting inside a red shell. There is a patient intelligence in that habit, quietly radical too. By midday the sun presses harder, and the scent of the earth warms. The greens smell stronger. The crushed grass at the garden edge gives off sweetness. Insects tick in the weeds. Sweat runs down the spine and gathers at the waistband. A hand wipes the forehead with the back of the wrist, leaves a streak of dirt, and returns to work. The touch of the hoe handle is smooth in some places, splintered in others. The labour is delicate compared with field work, yet it still taxes tired muscles. Even bending to pick beans becomes difficult when a body already carries the day's weight. You see how produce from such a patch might alter the rhythm of meals. Beans added to a pot make it stretch further and nourish more deeply. Squash softens into stews. Onions lift bland food with fragrance alone. Peas offer protein and comfort together. A few peppers can wake an entire dish and fool the mouth into feeling abundance. Clever mouths can be persuaded. The stomach is harder to fool, but not impossible. Sometimes extra produce could be traded in tiny local economies that existed in the margins of plantation life. Eggs, vegetables, herbs, or handmade items might move between enslaved people, poor whites, or local markets under certain conditions. The details varied greatly, and not every plantation allowed such movement. Yet when it happened, it gave food another dimension. A turnip could become soap, peppers could become thread, a handful of peas could become the possibility of something different in the pot. Survival loves exchange. The emotional atmosphere of the garden is complicated. It contains tenderness, but never innocence. These are not carefree country beds from a cheerful painting. They are patches coaxed from a system that preferred dependence. Yet it is precisely because the system was so cruel that the sight becomes moving. A line of beans, neatly trained, says that someone refused total surrender to monotony. A hill of potatoes says someone thought ahead through fatigue. A bucket of saved rainwater says someone noticed the sky and planned accordingly. Even the sounds are softer here. Leaves brushing each other. The thud of loosened earth. The faint rattle of dry pods. A distant axe somewhere else on the property. A bird hopping the fence line as though it has not the slightest respect for ownership. A small laugh this time, real and quick. When a child discovers a worm and then recoils as if insulted. Life insists on happening in the cracks. As evening comes, the harvest from a small patch might look unimpressive to an outsider. A basket with greens, a few onions, some peas, perhaps one or two sweet potatoes, hardly the image of plenty. But place that basket beside nothing, and it becomes extraordinary. Place it beside a weekly ration of cornmeal and salt pork, and it becomes the difference between surviving narrowly and surviving with a little more strength, a little more flavour, a little more chance. So you remain by the garden as the light lowers and the heat begins to loosen from the ground. The leaves darken into shadow. The soil holds the warmth of the day. Someone shakes dirt from a root and drops it into a basket with a hollow. Satisfying knock. The smell rising from that basket is green, spicy, earthy, alive. In this small enclosure of rows and mounds, life is being negotiated by hand, not in grand gestures, but in beans, greens, onions, and roots lifted from the ground with care. By late afternoon, the cooking fire becomes the centre of gravity. You step into the close warmth of a cabin where the air is thick with wood smoke, damp cloth, and the deep savoury scent of something slowly changing in an iron pot. The room is dim except for the hearth. Firelight touches the walls in soft orange flashes, then slides away again. A kettle gives a low hiss. Fat sputters somewhere in short, impatient bursts. The sounds are small, but they fill the space completely. Here, survival depends less on what the ration was than on what skilled hands can persuade it to become. The tools are few, that is obvious at once. An iron pot hangs over coals. A skillet sits on a trivet dark with old grease and years of use. A wooden spoon has been worn smooth by constant stirring. A bowl with a chipped rim holds meal. A dull knife flashes and disappears in the moving light. Nothing looks elegant. Everything looks necessary. The beauty lies in the knowledge, not the equipment. You watch a woman test the heat by holding her hand near the skillet. She does not waste emotion. Her fingers know the fire better than a thermometer ever could. She tips in a small piece of salt pork, and the room changes instantly. The smell blooms outward, rich and salty, carrying a promise far larger than the meat itself. That is one of the great skills of plantation cooking. A very little can be made to seem like more, not by illusion alone, but by technique. The pork is not served in generous slabs. It is cut small, sometimes very small, because its fat and salt are more valuable spread through a dish than swallowed in a single bite. A strip is rendered slowly until grease shines in the pan. Bits turn brown at the edges. Then meal may be added, or onions if any are available, or chopped greens, or peas, depending on what the household has managed to gather. The whole meal becomes flavoured by contact. Even a spoonful of grease can carry comfort through a pot. It is culinary mathematics, and it is exacting. Cornmeal remains a constant companion in this world. but it does not have to be the same every time. That is where skill enters like a quiet magician. Stirred into boiling water, it becomes mush, soft and plain, able to be eaten quickly before work or sleep. Pressed into cakes and set near the fire, it becomes firm and portable. Frayed in fat, it develops a crisp edge that gives the mouth something to notice. Baked under ashes, it picks up a smoky crust and a denser centre. The ingredients may be repetitive and the methods create variety. You hear the spoons scraping the bottom of the pot in slow circles. That sound matters. A distracted cook might let meal stick and scorch too soon. A practiced one keeps it moving just enough. The texture changes gradually from thin and sloshy to thick and heavy. Steam rises against your face, carrying the simple, sweet smell of corn. Not bright sweetness, a duller one. Dry fields and stored grain softened by heat. It is not a fancy aroma, yet in this cabin it feels reassuring. Touch plays its part as much as taste. Dough is judged by hand, not measurement. Too wet, and it spreads uselessly. Too dry, and it cracks. Fingers press, fold, pat, and turn. A cook can tell by resistance alone whether a cake will hold together. The surface of the dough cools quickly while the inside stays slightly warm from the hand. Then it goes to the skillet or the hearthstone, where heat firms it into food sturdy enough to survive being tucked into cloth or carried to the fields. You notice that cooking here is never separate from conservation. Every stage asks the same question. How can this stretch water extend a dish? Fat enriches it. Crumbled stale bread thickens it. Greens wilt down into almost nothing, yet their pot liquor becomes part of the meal too. Bones, if there are any, are simmered until they surrender all possible flavour. Nothing useful is discarded lightly. Waste would feel almost obscene. A man near the fire crumbles cold corn cake into a bowl and moistens it with hot liquid from the pot. Suddenly yesterday's food becomes tonight's supper. It softens into something spoonable and warm. You can imagine the relief of that first mouthful after a day of labour, when even heat itself feels nourishing. The tongue meets softness instead of hardness. Salt opens across the palate. Smoke lingers at the back of the throat. The stomach receives something it can use without effort. Small mercies are still mercies. There is a remarkable creativity in these kitchens, and much of it comes from African culinary knowledge carried into the Americas under terrible conditions. One clear example is the practice of building flavour in a pot through layering, beginning with fat, aromatics if available, and then greens or legumes cooked low and slow. The result is not random peasant improvisation, as older writers sometimes implied with tiresome snobbery. It is technique shaped by memory, adaptation, and disciplined observation. You taste continuity in the food, even when the ingredients have been constrained by slavery. Okra, where available, offers a perfect lesson in this. Sliced into a pot, it releases a thickening quality that changes texture and makes a stew feel fuller. Some people love that silkiness, some pretend not to. But on a plantation table, a thickened pot means the food seems richer and holds together better. Combined with peas, onion, or bits of pork, okra turns scarcity into something almost luxurious. Almost. No need to get carried away. A stew is still a stew, yet the body notices the difference. Rice appears in certain regions more than others, especially in the coastal south, where enslaved Africans and their descendants brought critical knowledge about rice cultivation and cooking. In those places, a pot of rice might become the centre of a meal, absorbing broth, fat, or vegetable juices with quiet efficiency. Rice is patient food. It waits for company. It catches flavour and holds it. The scent of cooking rice is gentler than cornmeal, softer and cleaner, and when a lid is lifted the steam seems to brighten the whole room. Historians still argue over how much daily plantation cooking reflected direct continuities from particular African regions, and how much emerged through forced blending in the Americas. The question is difficult because the archive is uneven, and enslaved cooks rarely got to explain themselves in their own written words. But the food itself suggests memory at work. Thickened stews, one-pot dishes, careful use of greens, skillful seasoning of starches, all point toward traditions too coherent to be accidental. You also see how cooking time must fit labour schedules. Food often needs to be ready fast or able to wait without spoiling, or sturdy enough to be eaten cold. That shapes the menu. A thin porridge can be swallowed quickly in the dark before dawn. A dense cake can travel in a pocket. A pot of peas can sit near the fire and improve while chores continue. The cook does not have the luxury of an idle afternoon devoted to one beautiful dish. This is cuisine under pressure, always mindful of the clock and the next demand. The cabin fills gradually with people and with tiredness. Their movements slow near the fire, shoulders loosen a little. Dust from the day clings to hems and trouser legs. A child leans too close to the hearth and is pulled back by habit more than warning. Someone takes a lid off the pot and stirs. Someone else tears a cake in half and hands over the larger piece without comment. The air grows warmer and more crowded. Smoke settles into your hair. Grease shines on the edge of the spoon. Hunger sharpens everyone's attention. Then comes the matter of taste, which outsiders often underestimate. There is a habit of speaking about survival food as though people stopped caring about flavour once hungry enough. That is nonsense. In fact, flavour becomes more important because it gives emotional shape to necessity. Salt matters, smoke matters, bitterness from greens matters, heat from pepper matters, a touch of sweetness from molasses or sweet potato matters. These sensations tell the mind that food is not merely fuel. It is also feeling, memory and dignity. One quirky detail from old Southern accounts is the intense fondness many people had for the browned, crisp edges of corn cakes or cracklings. Those little concentrated bits offered texture and a burst of flavour that plain mush could never provide. Children probably watched for them with great seriousness. Adults too, though perhaps with more diplomacy. The edge piece has started family arguments in many times and places. Human nature remains surprisingly consistent when fried food is involved. The methods of cooking also protect the body in subtle ways. Long simmering makes tough vegetables tender. It softens dried peas. It extracts flavour from scraps that would otherwise seem useless. Ash baking allows food to cook with little equipment. Pan frying makes starch more satisfying and sometimes more portable. Slow rendering captures every possible drop of fat. This is not grand cuisine for aristocratic praise. It is intelligence under constraint, and it deserves to be recognised as such. You watch one cook add a handful of chopped greens to the pot just before serving so they keep a little colour and do not surrender completely. Another stirs them earlier for softness. Preferences differ. Techniques differ too. Some households likely prized a firmer cake, others a spoonable meal. Some saved grease carefully for special use, while others spent it quickly because tomorrow was uncertain. No two cooks would solve scarcity in exactly the same way. There is also the ever-present problem of spoilage. Salt pork can turn if neglected. Cooked grains sour in heat. Leftovers must be managed carefully. Reheating helps. Drying helps. Keeping pots near but not too near the coals helps. The nose becomes a judge of safety. Sour can mean pleasantly fermented in one context and dangerous in another. A cook learns the difference the hard way, or from an elder who spares her the lesson. Plantation kitchens were classrooms in that sense, though no one would have chosen the tuition. At last the food is ladled out. The portions are not large, they never are large enough, but they are hot, and hot food carries comfort beyond its measure. A bowl warms the hands first, then the chest. Steam brushes the face. The first spoonful of mush, or peas, or stewed greens settles the stomach and quiets it for a while. Not for long. Long enough. Sometimes long enough is what survival looks like. The room changes once people begin eating. The talk softens. Spoons touch bowls in a gentle rhythm. Breathing slows. Even the children go quiet for a minute, which may be the most impressive miracle in the cabin. Firelight flickers over bent heads and tired hands. The smell of corn, smoke, greens, and pork hangs low and familiar. Outside, night insects begin their thin metallic song. Inside, the body receives what it has been waiting for all day. What keeps rising in your mind is how much depends on knowledge that is easy to overlook. The right thickness of dough, the proper use of drippings, the timing of greens, the saving of stale crumbs, the judging of fire by sound and heat. None of it is glamorous. All of it is life-preserving. Food in this cabin is not passive. It is worked on, reasoned with, coaxed, and transformed. The meal arrives because someone knew exactly how to make rough ingredients submit to care. So you remain by the hearth as the last cakes finish browning and the pot settles into a quiet simmer. The iron gives off a deep stored heat. The smoke is softer now. Someone wipes the spoon and sets it aside for morning. In the glow of coals and worn hands, cooking reveals itself not as a domestic backdrop but as a daily craft of endurance, where fire, fat, grain, and skill meet in the narrow but stubborn space between hunger and strength. At the edge of the plantation, the land loosens its grip a little. The rows end. The strict geometry of labour gives way to reed beds, muddy banks, willow shade, and narrow trails pressed into the earth by many cautious feet. You step into that softer borderland at first light, when the air feels cool and wet against your skin and the world smells of river mud, green cane, and the faint mineral scent of water moving over roots. Frogs mutter in the shallows. Insects skim the surface in tiny silver flashes. Somewhere out in the mist, a bird gives a lonely call that seems too elegant for such a hard place. Here, food can still be found, but only by patience, knowledge, and a willingness to work in silence. You move along a creek bank where the mud holds fresh prints, human feet, dog paws, a raccoon, perhaps, maybe something larger. The ground is slick, and each step pulls slightly at your soles as though the earth itself is reluctant to let you pass. The reeds brush your legs with a damp whisper. Their smell is sharp and green, different from the smoky scent of the cabin yard. This is another food world entirely, not rationed, not measured out, not handed down through authority. It must be noticed, understood, and taken. Fish are the obvious prize, small fish, often, rather than grand river monsters fit for heroic paintings. Perch, catfish, bream, sunfish, eels in some regions, whatever the local waters could offer. To someone truly hungry, size is a secondary concern. A small fish can still become a meal, especially if several are caught. You watch a man lift a woven trap from the shallows. Water pours out in bright threads. Inside, a few fish flash and slap against the wicker. Their scales catch the light like bits of tin. It is not a miraculous haul. It is enough to matter. The trap itself deserves attention. It is handmade, practical, and clever, shaped by local materials and old habits. Wicker, split cane, bent branches, whatever can be coaxed into holding fish while letting water pass. The design relies on fish entering easily and leaving poorly, which is a trick many systems have used on living creatures, though this one at least ends in stew rather than law. A trap set at dusk and checked at dawn turns time into labour. Even while the body sleeps or works elsewhere, the creek is working too. Some people fished with lines, hooks, nets, or simple improvised methods. Others used baskets, weirs, or barriers built where water narrowed. Regional knowledge mattered greatly. A person raised near swamps thought differently from one raised near fast streams. The body learned where fish gathered in shade, where they nosed along mud bottoms, where they were easiest to catch after rain, and which pools shrank in dry weather, until the fish practically announced their own defeat. Nature has its moods. Skilled people read them. You kneel near the bank and trail your hand just above the water. The surface gives off a cool breath. Muddy water smells rich and old, full of decaying leaves and living things. It is not a clean mountain scent. It is thicker than that, warmer, dense with rot and promise together. A fish breaks the surface for a split second, then vanishes, leaving rings that widen and disappear. That tiny movement makes every eye nearby sharpen. Hunger trains attention with remarkable efficiency. Fish could be cooked fresh if caught in time, especially in cooler weather or when the cabin fire was already going. Fried in a little grease, stewed in a pot, roasted on a stick, or simply laid near coals. They brought precious protein and variety. Their smell while cooking was unmistakable. Oily, savoury, a little sweet in some species, stronger in others. A cabin that had fish in the pan smelled different from one with only meal and pork. The whole air changed. Even the mood might lift slightly. Not because people suddenly forgot their circumstances, but because the mouth had something new to notice. Then there were turtles, particularly in marshy or riverine areas where they were available and where local knowledge made catching them possible. Turtles are not sentimental creatures. They look ancient and mildly annoyed, as though life has interrupted them personally, but they can become important food. Turtle meat, once cleaned and cooked, offered nourishment that could stretch a pot. Some accounts from the south mention enslaved people catching terrapins or freshwater turtles, though how often depended very much on local ecology. A marsh can hide supper under a shell if you know where to look. You also see boys moving along the water with a quiet intensity that belongs to people who have learned to spot movement others miss. One pauses, then lunges with both hands into the shallows near a root. He comes up empty, splattered, and breathing hard. Another time he might come up with a small fish or crayfish. Skill grows from many empty tries. The body remembers each one. Wet mud climbs his calves. He wipes his hand on his shirt and scans the water again. Crayfish and shellfish could also supplement diets in some areas. Crawfish in ditches and creeks, mussels in rivers, oysters in coastal regions. None of these were universal, and not all waters were generous. But where they existed, they expanded the menu beyond plantation issue food. Imagine a pot with fish or shellfish simmered together with onions, peppers, or greens if available. The aroma would be rich, almost festive by local standards. A poor pot, perhaps, but not a joyless one. Historians still debate how widespread these supplementary food practices were across plantations, because records often reflect local conditions rather than broad surveys. Some regions provided ready access to marshes and streams, others did not. Some enslavers tolerated fishing because it reduced complaints and costs. Others restricted movement more tightly. Geography and control worked together in messy combinations. Yet enough evidence survives to show that for many enslaved black Americans, the edges of rivers and ponds offered real nutritional support. Small game joined the picture too. Rabbits, squirrels, possums, birds, and whatever else could be trapped, snared, or struck when chance allowed. No one here is strolling out for sport. This is not a gentleman's hunt with polished boots and boasting. It is low, practical, and watchful. A snare set near a game trail. A club ready near a roost. A thrown stone timed just right. Quiet methods suit hard lives. They also suit people who do not wish to explain themselves. The sounds of this work are subtle. Water dripping from a trap, a line tightening, reeds knocking together, a low whisper warning someone not to step there, the sudden flap of startled wings, then stillness again. Even the stillness feels active. You can almost hear eyes working. Smell, too, becomes a guide. Mud disturbed by a turtle, the cleaner scent of running water, the rank note of fish left too long in the sun. The nose monitors opportunity and danger at once. There are also seasonal rhythms. Spring floods can shift fish patterns and make certain grounds difficult to reach. Summer heat can shrink ponds and concentrate fish, though it also brings spoilage faster. Autumn may offer clearer water and easier travel along drier banks. Winter changes everything again, slowing some creatures and sharpening the wind against wet hands. A person who lives close to hunger notices the calendar through the behavior of animals, not by a printed page. One curious tidbit appears in scattered descriptions from the 19th century. In some places, people were known to use plant knowledge alongside fishing methods, not in dramatic poison schemes fit for lurid storytelling, but in modest ways that influenced trapping, baiting, or locating creatures in shallow water. The details are frustratingly vague, because observers often notice the result without understanding the method. That happens often in the historical record. Skilled labour is seen. The intelligence behind it is blurred. You watch a small catch being sorted on the bank. Fish too tiny to bother with may still be kept because small fish can be fried whole or added to a pot for flavour. Larger ones are worth more effort. Scales cling to fingers. Slime shines on skin. A knife works quickly, though not wastefully. The smell is strong now. Iron and river mixed together. Gulls might circle in a coastal place. Here, maybe crows wait from a nearby branch, hopeful and shameless. Bringing the catch home is another art. Fish spoil quickly in heat. They must be cleaned, cooked, or salted if possible. Some may be smoked lightly near the hearth. Others go straight into the pot. Turtle requires more preparation. Small game must be skinned and cleaned. Nothing about this extra food is effortless. That matters. Supplements did not float into life like a blessing from the clouds. They demanded labour on top of labour, skill on top of fatigue. Still, the reward could be substantial. A little flesh in the pot changes a week. You can imagine supper when fishing has gone well. A pan of fish dusted with meal and fried until the edges crisp. The crackle alone would draw every child closer to the fire. Or a stew, cloudy and fragrant, where fish breaks into flakes beside onion and herbs. Maybe a rabbit stretched with peas. Maybe turtle simmered until the broth turns rich. These are not luxury dishes, but they are worlds away from unvaried cornmeal. Texture returns, aroma returns, appetite becomes something other than dread. There is a social side to this food gathering too. Knowledge passes by, watching, correcting, and trying again. One person knows where to set a trap after rain, another knows how to skin a squirrel cleanly, another can tell from the water's surface where the fish are moving close to shore. Children absorb this without formal lessons. They carry lines, bait hooks, fetch baskets, and learn to stand still when standing still matters. Survival knowledge enters the body by repetition. At times, these watery margins must have felt almost peaceful. The breeze on the skin, the shade of cypress or willow, the shimmer of light on water, the brief sensation of stepping outside the plantation's regular rhythm. But peace would be too simple a word. Risk lived here too. Snakes in the grass, deep mud, sharp shells, sudden weather. The possibility of being questioned or punished depending on time, place, and local rules. Even so, many returned again and again because the edge of the water offered something the ration system did not. Chance. Chance can be a powerful companion. As dusk approaches, the wet world grows louder. Frogs thrum from the reeds. Insects whine close to the ear. Mosquitoes arrive with rude confidence. The mud cools underfoot. Your hands smell of fish scales and creek water, a scent that lingers even after wiping them on cloth. A basket feels heavier now with a catch inside, not heavy enough to make anyone careless. Heavy enough to quicken the step toward home. The nutritional value of these foods should not be underestimated. Fish and small game provided protein, fats, and minerals that basic plantation rations often lacked in sufficient quantity or freshness. Fresh animal foods also relieved monotony, and monotony itself can wear down appetite over time. A person may eat because they must, but they endure better when the meal occasionally tastes alive. That may sound poetic. It is also practical. So you stay by the bank a moment longer as the day softens into evening and the water turns from brown to black. A trap rests empty, another full enough. Reeds sway against a violet sky. Someone lifts a basket. Someone coils a line. Someone rinses muddy hands in the shallows and watches the clouded water drift away. In this damp borderland of frogs, mud, fish, and patient skill, the plantation's narrow food world is widened by quiet harvests drawn from creek and marsh, one careful catch at a time. The woods begin where the worked land seems to lose interest in neatness. You leave behind the open fields and step under a cover of branches that softens the light into green shadow. The air changes at once. It feels cooler on your face, heavier in your lungs, rich with the smell of leaf mould, damp bark, crushed fern, and the faint peppery scent of wild plants bruised underfoot. A squirrel chatters overhead with rude certainty. Somewhere deeper in the trees, a woodpecker taps a trunk in a patient rhythm. Here, food does not sit in rows or swim in plain sight. It hides. You must know how to look. Foraging is often imagined as a cheerful woodland ramble by people who have never needed the result. In reality, it is careful work performed under pressure. You scan the ground, the shrubs, the vines, the lower branches. You notice shape, season, colour, smell. You learn where acorns fall thick, where blackberries catch enough sun to ripen well, where wild onions push through soft ground, and where mushrooms should be treated with profound suspicion. The forest offers gifts, yes, but only to those who can separate a blessing from a mistake. Nature can nourish you. It can also make your evening very memorable for all the wrong reasons. You kneel near a patch of low plants and spot berries darkening among the leaves. Blackberries, perhaps, or dewberries in a sunnier opening. Their canes catch at sleeves and scratch the backs of hands. The fruit itself is soft and warm from the day, smelling faintly of wine and summer. When ripe, it yields with almost indecent generosity, staining fingers purple and sweetening the mouth in a way ration food never could. Fresh berries are not merely calories, they are relief, sharp, juicy, a live relief. Children were often especially skilled at gathering such foods. Their eyes worked close to the ground. Their bodies moved quickly through brush. They knew where persimmons hung late into the season, where muscadines hid in tangles, where hickory nuts dropped in numbers worth the bending. One can imagine their seriousness in this work. Yes, there would have been moments of playfulness. No child stops being a child entirely. But when wild fruit might become supper, every handful mattered. Nuts were a quiet treasure of the southern landscape. Hickory nuts, walnuts, pecans in some regions, acorns if processed properly, all offered dense nutrition that plantation rations often lacked. Fat, protein, and the deep satisfaction of chewing something with substance. A cracked hickory nut smells sweet and woody at once. The shell is stubborn. The meat inside is rich and slightly oily, with a flavour that lingers warmly on the tongue. The work of gathering and cracking them could be tedious, but tedium is easier to tolerate when the result keeps hunger from becoming sharper. Acorns are especially interesting because they remind you that knowledge transforms harsh ingredients into useful food. Many acorns contain bitter tannins and cannot simply be eaten straight from the ground in pleasant innocence. They must be leached and processed. That requires time, water, and understanding. Some indigenous peoples across North America mastered acorn preparation on a grand scale. Enslaved black Americans in certain places also knew how to use acorns when necessary or useful. Though how commonly depended on local custom and need, the lesson remains the same. The land gives more to those who know its difficult language. You move farther along a narrow path, hardly more than a gap through shrubs, and catch the smell of wild onion before you see it. The scent rises clean and sharp from the ground when a stem is crushed under your boot. Nearby there may be garlic grass, maybe sorrel with its tart leaves, perhaps poke in the proper stage if someone knows how to prepare it safely. Wild greens and herbs occupy a tricky middle ground between food and medicine. They freshen a pot, they wake the palate. They can also support a body worn down by sameness. A handful of leaves can change an entire meal's spirit. The forest floor itself is a map of possibilities. Vines suggest grapes, thorny tangles suggest berries. Open glades hint at edible weeds and young shoots. Moist pockets near streams may offer cresses or roots. Sandy patches tell a different story. You notice all of this because foraging requires a mind tuned to pattern. Food is rarely announced with a signboard and a cheerful caption. It must be inferred from habitat, timing, and signs left by animals. If birds are feasting in one area, perhaps something is ripening. If the ground beneath a certain tree is dug up, perhaps roots there are worth investigating. Squirrels are annoying neighbours, but competent informants. Roots and tubers formed another hidden layer of sustenance. Wild yam in some areas, groundnuts, and other edible roots could supplement diets when known and accessible. Groundnuts are a particularly fascinating example. They are native vine plants with edible tubers, and several historical accounts suggest their use by poor rural communities, including some enslaved people. They do not look like a feast from above. You dig for them. The soil clings stubbornly. Then out comes a knotted, earthy treasure, looking humble enough to insult you before dinner and impress you after it. Boiled or roasted, such roots could offer meaningful energy. Historians still argue over the extent to which enslaved communities depended on truly wild plant foods versus cultivated supplements. because the records are scattered and often filtered through outsiders who noticed only what seemed unusual. A traveller might mention berries because berries feel picturesque. The same traveller might overlook a basket of gathered greens because greens look ordinary. But ordinary things often sustain life more reliably than dramatic ones. It is likely that wild foods mattered differently in different regions, seasons and households. Where the land permitted and knowledge endured, foraging helped widen the margin of survival. There is also danger in this work, and not only from poisonous plants. To forage successfully, you often move beyond the most visible parts of the plantation into spaces less supervised but never fully safe. Thick woods can conceal snakes, briars tear skin and cloth, insects bite with democratic enthusiasm. Sudden storms turn paths to slippery confusion. Then there is the human danger. Any movement outside expected routines could invite suspicion depending on local conditions and the temper of those in power. A basket of berries might look innocent to one observer and like theft of time to another. Survival has an exhausting way of requiring courage for tasks that should be ordinary. The sounds around you deepen as the sun lowers. Cicadas start their shrill electric chorus. Leaves rustle with unseen movement. Dry twigs snap underfoot if you're careless. A rabbit bursts from cover and vanishes before your heart has finished reacting. The smell of warm pine resin drifts from a sunlit trunk. Then comes the sweeter scent of ripe fruit from a vine climbing into the edge of the canopy. Muscadines, perhaps. Thick-skinned, dark, and richly flavoured. They are one of the South's great small luxuries. Bite one and the juice is intense, almost floral, with a wild sweetness that feels nothing like refined sugar. A quirky detail from old rural food traditions is that many gathered foods were eaten not only fresh, but also improvised into simple preserves, drinks, or seasonings when time and means allowed. Berries could be cooked down. Nuts could be pounded into meal or added to other dishes. Fruit skins and scraps might flavour water or syrup. Nothing was too humble to invite another use. That attitude thrives where scarcity teaches the eye to keep asking, what else can this become? You find a cluster of mushrooms on a log and wisely do not touch them. This is where bedtime history remains calm but not foolish. Wild mushrooms can be delicious, and they can also send a person into a regrettable relationship with eternity. Foraging cultures usually develop strong rules around them, passed carefully from experienced gatherers to others. Without that knowledge, restraint is the better virtue. The forest is generous enough without gambling your stomach on a fungus that looks confident. Persimmons appear later in the year, and they are worth remembering because they teach patience better than many schoolmasters. Unripe persimmons are famously astringent. Bite too soon, and your mouth feels as though it has been lined with wool and disappointment. Wait until the fruit softens fully, and it becomes honeyed, fragrant, and almost custard-like. People living close to the land know this instinctively. Ripeness is not just visual. It is tactile, aromatic, seasonal. You press lightly, smell deeply, judge carefully. The body learns timing because timing feeds it. Many wild foods also entered the cooking pot alongside plantation staples rather than replacing them. A handful of wild greens cooked with meal, a basket of berries beside cornbread, nuts added to a mash or eaten between meals. Foraged ingredients often functioned as extensions, enrichments, or brief corrections to a diet that remained anchored in rationed foods. Their value was not only caloric, they brought freshness, micronutrients, flavour, and a sense that the land still held possibilities outside the measured issue of the plantation. The emotional texture of foraging is distinct from gardening or ration distribution. It contains more uncertainty, more searching, more moments of maybe the berries ripened here, maybe the nuts fell after the windstorm, maybe the stream bank holds watercress, maybe the vine with promising leaves actually hides nothing useful today. This uncertainty can be tiring. It can also sharpen hope. The hand pushes aside brush and does not know yet whether it will come back empty or full. There is a certain aching optimism in that gesture. You notice how baskets matter here. Woven, patched. Practical baskets swinging against a leg or carried on the arm. They collect the forest in fragments. A few onions, a clutch of greens, some berries wrapped in leaves, nuts in the bottom, perhaps one root still dusted with soil. The basket becomes a record of attention. Every item inside marks a plant recognized, a season understood, a risk taken, a chance used well. As evening thickens, the woods begin to smell cooler again. Damp earth rises stronger. The sweetness of ripe fruit fades under the heavier scent of leaves and bark. Bats flicker overhead. The path out seems narrower than it did on the way in. Your hands are scratched. Your skirt hem or trouser leg is streaked with green and brown. A thorn has caught a thread. The basket is not full enough to invite complacency, but it is no longer empty. That matters. The nutritional contribution of these wild foods could be modest or meaningful depending on the day, yet even modest additions mattered in bodies under strain. Vitamin-rich greens helped counter monotony and deficiency. Fruits offered sugars, hydration, and relief. Nuts added concentrated nourishment. Roots filled out the stomach and diversified the diet. A person surviving on plantation food did not need the forest to provide banquets. The forest only needed to provide enough, often enough, to shift the balance slightly away from weakness. And there is one more thing here. Harder to measure, but no less real. Foraging keeps alive a relationship with landscape that slavery constantly tried to narrow. The field says work where you are told. The woods ask, what do you know? A person who can step under the trees and read food in vine, leaf, bark, and season carries an intelligence no ledger can reduce. Quiet intelligence, mobile intelligence, the sort that leaves little paper trail and abundant consequence. So you pause at the edge of the trees while the last light sifts through the branches in thin gold bands. A basket rests against your hip, smelling of berries, leaves, root soil, and crushed stems. Crickets begin their evening song. The open plantation lies beyond the shadows, stern and hungry as ever. Yet in your hands you carry evidence that the woods, with all their risks and riddles, have offered back a little nourishment to those patient enough to seek it. Night settles over the plantation with a slow, smoky patience, and inside the cabins a different kind of labour begins. You step into a room where the day's heat still lingers in the walls, where the hearth glows low and red, and where the air carries a layered scent of ash, cured meat, damp wood, and food being guarded against tomorrow. A pot may feed the evening, but survival depends just as much on what can be kept. The body is always hungry again. That is the plain truth. So every scrap that can be preserved becomes a quiet bargain with the future. You see it first in the pork. Salt has already done part of the work long before the meat reached this place. The surface is firm, a little sticky in spots, pale with crystals, darker where the flesh shows through. It smells sharp, almost aggressive, especially before it is rinsed or cooked. Salted meat is not delicate, it is blunt and practical, but in a world without easy refrigeration, that bluntness is life-saving. A piece of pork that lasts can season many meals. A piece that rots too soon becomes a cruel little tragedy. Salt was one of the great silent forces in 19th century food survival. It preserved meat, sharpened flavour, and helped stretch supplies across days and weeks that would otherwise strip a household bare. In plantation kitchens, salted pork or bacon often arrived as part of the ration system because it kept better in southern heat than fresh meat would. Of course, the salt also meant thirst, and the meat could be intensely salty when cooked. Yet people learned how to manage it. Soaking, boiling, skimming, slicing, thin, mixing with other foods. Preservation always invites technique. You watch someone cut a narrow strip from a larger piece and set the rest aside with care. The knife works slowly, not because the hand is uncertain, but because each cut is a decision. Too much today means less tomorrow. The slab is wrapped again, perhaps in cloth, perhaps placed in a container, perhaps hung away from animals if there is any place safe enough. The whole room shares an awareness of limited stores. Food is not casually set down. It is positioned, watched, and remembered. Smoke does another kind of preserving, near the hearth. You notice fish split and set where heat and smoke can reach them without burning. They are not being cooked for immediate supper. They are being hardened against spoilage. The scent is wonderful in a stern way. deep and woody, touched with oil and river. Smoke enters the flesh and settles there. It dries the surface, darkens the skin, and gives the future a better chance of tasting good. The texture will change too. Firmer, chewier, less tender perhaps, but much less perishable. In harsh circumstances, tenderness is nice. Longevity is essential. Small game could be treated similarly when the catch allowed. A rabbit, a squirrel, strips of meat from a bird, all might be smoked, dried, or cooked down depending on local habit and available fuel. Fuel matters more than many people realize. Preservation by heat requires wood, time, and watchfulness. A fire cannot be too wild. It cannot die too soon. Smoke must drift around the food rather than scorch it into waste. The cook becomes part firekeeper, part chemist, part accountant. All this while probably very tired, which feels rude on history's part. Drying food in the southern climate was both useful and difficult. Warm air helps evaporation, but humidity can spoil a good plan with great enthusiasm. You can almost feel that thickness in the air tonight. Your skin is slightly damp. Cloth clings at the neck. The walls hold moisture. In such conditions, preserving food means judging weather as much as ingredients. A dry stretch of days invites more confidence. A wet spell brings worry. The nose hovers close. The fingers test surfaces. Is it drying or turning? The answer matters a great deal. Corn itself could also be preserved and managed in several forms. Whole kernels, if available, kept differently from ground meal. Meal had to be protected from dampness, insects, and rodents, all of whom regarded it as a shared community resource. Rats, in particular, brought their own opinions about ownership, so cornmeal might be stored in sacks, barrels, or bins, raised if possible, covered if possible, guarded always. A spoiled ration of meal meant not just inconvenience, but days of hunger arriving much too soon. You watch a woman lift a sack and shift its place away from the wall. She checks the bottom with her palm for dampness. Her fingertips come away dusty, not wet. Good. Then she knots the opening again and pushes the sack higher, out of easier reach of pests. This kind of motion rarely appears in grand historical paintings. No one commissions a masterpiece called Practical Woman Protecting Cornmeal from Rodents. Yet it belongs in any honest picture of survival. Keeping food safe is as important as cooking it well. Molasses, when a household had any, brought another preserving possibility. Thick syrup does not spoil as quickly as many fresh foods. It can sweeten course meals, enrich baking, or sometimes help carry other ingredients. A little stirred into meal changes both flavour and mood. A little saved in a crock becomes insurance against a bleak morning. The smell of molasses in warm air is dark and comforting, almost smoky in itself, with that deep burnt sweetness that feels heavier than sugar. Even a spoon scraped along the side of a near-empty container could be treasured. There is an old fringe detail from rural southern foodways that fits neatly here. Some households saved rendered fat with almost ceremonial seriousness, pouring it into small containers, guarding every drop, and using it later for frying, seasoning, or greasing cookware. To modernise, this may seem ordinary enough. To hungry people, it was closer to treasure. Fat meant energy. It meant flavour. It meant food could be cooked in a way that felt satisfying rather than merely edible. Cold grease congealed in a cup might not look noble, but it glowed with possibility. Historians still argue over how much autonomy enslaved households had in storing and preserving their own food versus relying on central plantation systems, because practices varied widely from place to place. Some large plantations may have issued food in ways that left little room for household management. Others, especially where small gardens, fishing, or personal food gathering were tolerated, allowed more opportunity for private storage. The variation matters, so does the constant truth beneath it. Whenever people had the chance to preserve food themselves, many did, because uncertainty governed every week. Sweet potatoes offered one of the more forgiving storage foods. Kept properly, they could last longer than many fresh vegetables and remain filling, versatile, and pleasantly sweet. Their skins, dusty and plain, hid a softness that heat could unlock days later. Stored in a coolish dry place, or in heaps managed with care, they became a form of food security. You can imagine someone counting them with the eyes rather than the voice, already planning which would be cooked soon and which held for later. Beans and peas, once dried, were another gift to the future. They rattled faintly in their pods or in the storage sack, making a dry whispering sound that promised many meals ahead. Dried legumes keep well, cook slowly, and marry happily with almost any seasoning that can be spared. Their smell is faint until soaked and heated. Then they release that warm, earthy fragrance that belongs to humble food everywhere. A pot of peas simmering on a cold night carries a special kind of reassurance, the kind that says tomorrow has at least been considered. You notice that preserving food is also preserving labour. A smoked fish contains the memory of someone checking a trap at dawn. A sack of dried peas contains the memory of someone planting, weeding, picking, shelling, and saving. A piece of salt pork represents not only ration issue, but all the choices that kept it from being eaten too quickly. Food stores are made of time as much as substance. They are compressed effort. That gives them emotional weight. Losing stored food means losing labour already spent, and that loss bites twice. Cabin interiors at night often reveal these food strategies most clearly. Hooks near the hearth, small containers tucked into corners, cloths tied over openings, bundles hung from rafters where smoke drifts upward. The atmosphere is close and practical. Smoke stings the eyes slightly. The packed floor feels cool through thin soles. Somewhere a child yawns. Somewhere an older person clears a throat roughened by years of ash and weather. Above all, there is vigilance. Food cannot simply exist. It must be defended from insects, mould, theft, and careless use. And then there is the question of restraint. Preserved food asks to be saved. Hunger asks to be answered now. The struggle between those two voices must have been constant. Eat the extra fish tonight while it is delicious and warm, or smoke part of it, and leave yourself something 2 days from now. Use all the drippings to make the meal taste better, or save half for frying tomorrow's cakes. Open the last sack of peas, or hold it until the next ration day arrives. These are not abstract choices. They are felt in the stomach, in the nose, in the anxious little pause before a hand reaches for more. Children would have learned these lessons quickly, not through lectures, but through responses. No, do not take that. That is for later. Yes, this can be eaten now. No, leave the drying fish alone. A saved sweet potato is not hidden out of meanness. It is hidden because tomorrow is real. Food preservation teaches time discipline in a ruthless way. It asks people to imagine their future hunger and prepare for it while they are still hungry in the present. That is an exhausting sort of wisdom. The sensory world of preserved food is distinctive. Salt pork slick under the fingers after soaking, smoked fish leathery at the edges, dried peas hard as little stones in the hand, sweet potatoes cool and dusty in a basket, molasses thick on a spoon, slow as thought. The smells range from sharp salt to deep smoke, to the almost sweet mustiness of stored grain. These are not the scents of luxury, but they are the odours of continuity. They say the household may endure a little longer. There were failures too, inevitably. Meat spoiled, meal moulded, rats found a gap, weather shifted, smoke did not dry fast enough, a pot turned sour. Preservation is never perfect, especially under pressure and with limited tools. Yet even imperfect systems mattered. A little smoked fish, a little saved grease, a little sack of peas. These could carry a family through a lean spell, or soften the blow of a missed ration. Small reserves often stand between discomfort and crisis. What emerges most clearly in this night work is planning. Planning by people denied control over so much else. The right to move, to rest, to earn, to choose, all constrained or stolen. Yet within the narrow margins available, food preservation became an act of foresight. A humble one, perhaps, still powerful. To save something for later is to insist that later exists, that your life continues into it, that your household deserves to meet it with at least a little readiness. So you stay by the low fire as smoke curls upward and the coals settle deeper into red. A strip of fish darkens slowly near the hearth. A sack of meal is tied shut and set back in place. A cup of grease catches the firelight with a pale shine. Outside, night insects sing beyond the walls. Inside, hands move carefully through the last chores of the evening, preserving what they can from heat, hunger, and time itself. Inside the cabin, the deepest economy is not measured in sacks or baskets, but in people. You enter at evening and feel at once that the room is arranged around bodies as much as food. A baby sleeps against a shoulder. An older man sits close to the fire with knees angled carefully, conserving warmth. A girl leans against the wall, tired enough to be quiet. The air smells of smoke, starch, sweat dried into cloth, and a faint sweetness from something warm in the pot. Here, food does not move only from hand to mouth. It moves through judgment, affection, worry, and the quiet authority of those who know who needs what most. A bowl is set down near the hearth, then another. The portions are not equal, they are rarely meant to be. The strongest worker may receive more in one household. In another, the sick child comes first. In another, an elder is given the softest part because chewing has become difficult. These choices are small, but they are not casual. Someone has thought them through while stirring, slicing, and counting in the head. Plantation food survival depends not only on obtaining food, but on distributing it within the cabin with care sharper than any ledger. Women often stood at the centre of this domestic arithmetic, though never alone in all households. Mothers, grandmothers, aunts, older sisters, and unrelated women bound by proximity or shared burden commonly shaped how food was cooked, portioned, and protected. That labour could look ordinary from the outside, a hand passing a bowl, a spoon levelling portions, a bit of bread tucked away. Yet ordinary movements carried great consequence. A child fed first might sleep rather than cry. A nursing mother given extra broth might keep her strength. A weary elder offered softened food might avoid a day of weakness that the household could not afford. You watch one woman tilt the pot and let more liquid than solids fall into a small bowl for an old man. He wraps his hands around it slowly, enjoying the heat before the first sip. Another bowl is thicker, with more peas and bits from the bottom, and that goes to a young man whose shirt still carries field dust at the shoulders. A toddler receives food mashed finer with the back of a spoon. No one explains these decisions aloud. They do not need to. The room understands. This is caregiving under scarcity, and it has its own intense discipline. The person serving must know not only how much food exists, but what kind of hunger sits in front of her. There is the hunger of labour, the hunger of growth, the hunger of illness, the hunger of age, sometimes smaller in volume but greater in fragility. A household that survives learns to read faces, gait, colour, appetite, and fatigue. One look can tell you who is fading. One touch at the forehead can change supper's plan. The touch of care matters almost as much as the food itself. A hand steadies a bowl for someone whose fingers shake. Another tests the temperature for a child. Someone tears the tougher crust from a cake and softens it with liquid before passing it along. In the background, the fire ticks softly as sap pockets burst inside the wood. The spoon taps the rim once, twice. A sleeping child snuffles and turns. Everything feels intimate because everything is close. There is no room for distant concern here. Need is within arm's reach. Many enslaved households were fractured by sale, forced movement, or the working arrangements of the plantation, so kinship could not always rely on a simple nuclear family pattern. Care often extended through wider networks of relation. Fictive kin, as scholars call them now. Though the term sounds tidier than the reality. A woman might feed a neighbour's child while that child's mother laboured elsewhere. An elder without direct family nearby might still be folded into another household's supper. A teenage girl might become nurse, cook's helper, and food runner all at once. The cabin world could be elastic because it had to be. You see evidence of that elasticity in the small negotiations of the meal. A boy comes in late and receives a portion someone has obviously held back. A woman with a baby on her hip is handed a bowl without asking. A little hoe cake is divided into 3 parts, not 2, because another child has drifted close with that watchful look children get when they hope not to seem hungry. No one announces generosity. They simply make space for it. Historians still argue over how much plantation conditions allowed stable family meals and how often labour schedules or housing arrangements disrupted them. The answer likely varied enormously by region, crop, and plantation scale. Yet across many testimonies and observations, one pattern appears with force. Enslaved people built caregiving systems inside severe constraint, and food lay at the centre of those systems. It was one of the few resources that could be transformed directly into comfort, survival, and social obligation all at once. Mothers carried a particularly heavy burden in this world. They had to feed children from rations that were already inadequate, often while recovering from childbirth, nursing infants, or returning quickly to labour. Imagine the exhaustion. The baby pulls at you through the night. The field takes your strength by day. Then evening arrives and expects practical brilliance. Food must be made soft enough, filling enough, safe enough, and somehow enough. It is a cruel workload hidden inside the word mother, which history too often romanticizes when it should kneel before the effort, and yet tenderness persists. A woman cools a spoonful with her breath. A grandmother rubs a child's back while the child drinks broth too fast. Someone saves the browned edge of a cake for the oldest person in the room because he likes the crispness. Someone else scrapes the last molasses from a jar and lets two children share it on their fingers, not because it is nutritionally significant, but because delight matters too. Tiny sweetness can restore morale beyond its size. Elders were often crucial in these food worlds not only as recipients of care, but as keepers of knowledge. An older woman might know which greens soothed the stomach, which foods were best for fever, which root broth helped after childbirth, which porridge a teething child could manage. An older man might know how to stretch smoked meat through a week, how to judge spoiled meal by scent, or how to save seed from peas. Age could bring weakness, yes, but it also brought memory, and memory was deeply edible in such a place. There is a fringe but believable detail in many old communities under hardship. The person serving food often pretends not to be hungry, while making sure others eat first. This appears across cultures because love and worry make excellent liars. In plantation cabins, such gestures were probably common. A mother says she is fine. A grandmother claims she ate earlier. An older sister insists she only wants the broth. Sometimes it is true. Quite often it is not. The body learns to hide its own appetite when someone smaller or frailer is watching. You sense that concealment in the room. One woman lingers by the pot longer than necessary, scraping and stirring as if still busy. Only after others have begun eating does she take what remains. Her portion is thinner. She does not complain. Complaint would not fill the bowl. Still, the choice is visible to anyone paying attention. Care has a flavour, and it is often self-denial. The cabin atmosphere thickens as people settle into eating. Steam beads on cooler surfaces, the smell of cooked peas, greens, or meal hangs close under the rafters. A blanket near the wall gives off the dusty wool scent of long use. The warmth on your face from the hearth contrasts with the chill at your back. In that narrow band of comfort, the social order of the cabin reveals itself. Not hierarchy in the plantation sense. Something more protective, more human. Food is allocated according to vulnerability, usefulness, affection, and immediate need in combinations too subtle for outsiders to chart neatly. Children also learn generosity through these meals, though likely with occasional reluctance worthy of all children everywhere. A little boy breaks off part of his cake when told to share with a younger sibling, and he does it with the facial expression of a saint being tested beyond reason. A girl saves a bite for the woman holding the baby. These acts may be guided, nudged, or expected, but over time they become part of the household's moral language. To eat alone when others need is unthinkable if survival depends on mutuality. Food sharing could also extend beyond one cabin. Neighbours borrowed, exchanged, and compensated when possible. A woman with greens might trade for meal. A household with fish might share broth with someone caring for a sick person. A widow, an injured worker, or a new mother might receive help in moments of strain. Not every community was equally cohesive, and hardship can produce conflict as easily as kindness. Still, evidence from many times and places suggests that informal systems of mutual aid were essential. A plantation tried to isolate people into units of labour, Shared food quietly reassembled them into community. There is scholarly uncertainty about how visible these exchanges were to enslavers and overseers. Some probably knew and tolerated them when they stabilized the labor force. Others may have ignored them because domestic life within the quarters seemed unimportant compared with field output. And sometimes what is most important is exactly what power fails to notice. A spoonful of broth carried next door by candlelight does not look historic. It is. Illness sharpened all of this. When someone had fever, stomach trouble, an infected wound, or simple collapse from overwork, food had to change. Softer foods, more liquid. Smaller servings more often. Broths, porridges, mashed vegetables, teas from known herbs. This kind of care required both food management and bodily attention. The person cooking became observer and healer, watching whether the patient kept food down, whether strength returned, whether a better appetite signalled hope. In a world of limited medical access and deep exploitation, the cabin table often became the first clinic. Pregnancy and nursing created another layer of need. Women in these conditions required more nourishment than the ration system reliably supplied. Households had to adapt as best they could. Extra greens, softer starches, more broth, fish if available, sweet potatoes, anything that could support strength. Whether those needs were met depended on luck, season, community support, and the brutal demands of labour. But people recognized the need. Bodies taught them. Even when the plantation did not care, the emotional atmosphere around shared plates could be tender, tense, or both. Hunger makes people irritable. Fatigue does too. A child whines, someone snaps, then regrets it. Another person quietly pushes over a bite of food in apology rather than words. The room has little privacy, so feeling moves openly across it. Yet there is also humour. Even here. A grandparent teases a child for licking the bowl as if it were polished silver. Someone remarks that a certain pot has been stretched so far it deserves its own pair of shoes. Soft laughter follows. Gallows humour in a cabin apron. What remains with you most is the precision of care. Someone knows exactly how fine to mash the food for the baby. Someone else knows the elder needs less salt. Someone has remembered to save a heel of bread for a person arriving late from labour. These details. Yes. But history is often built from details repeated until they become a lifeline. A household survives not only because food exists, but because someone thinks carefully while tired. So you sit in the hush that comes after the first hunger is eased. Bowls rest in laps. The fire has dropped lower. A child sleeps sideways against a grandmother's leg. The smell of supper lingers in the warm, dim room, mixed now with wood ash and the softness of worn fabric. In this cramped space of passing hands and watchful eyes, staying alive depends not simply on what is cooked, but on how love, duty, and hard judgment divide each precious mouthful. You feel the body before you fully see it. In the plantation quarters, illness is not always dramatic. It lives in slower steps, in shoulders that sink too early, in a cough that clings to the chest, in the long pause before someone stands. The evening air is warm and close, heavy with smoke and the smell of boiled food, damp cloth and tired skin. A pot simmers low near the fire. Someone shifts on a stool and winces without comment. A child scratches at dry patches on an arm. The room is full of quiet evidence that food is never only about hunger. It is about strength, repair, resistance, and the steady, difficult argument between the body and the conditions forced upon it. Plantation labour in 1840 consumed human energy at a ruthless pace. Cotton demanded endless bending and picking. Sugar required punishing effort near mills and boiling houses. Rice labour brought wet feet, insects, heat, and exhausting repetition. Tobacco had its own heavy rhythm of planting, topping, cutting, and hanging. No matter the crop, the body paid daily, muscles burned fuel fast. Sweat carried away salt and water. Small injuries accumulated. Sleep rarely restored enough. In such a setting, food was supposed to replace what labour took. Too often it did not. A person can survive for a long time while still being undernourished. That is one of history's grimmer tricks. You keep moving, you keep working, you even look ordinary from a distance. But the signs gather. Thin wrists, swollen bellies in some children, dull hair, frequent fatigue, pale or greyish skin tones beneath dust and sweat, cuts healing slowly, women worn down by pregnancy and nursing, older people shrinking into themselves. Bodies do not always collapse in one visible moment. Sometimes they fade by increments. The plantation depended on that grey zone where a person remained useful while never truly well. Cornmeal and pork provided calories, and calories mattered immensely. No sensible person would dismiss them, yet a diet built too narrowly around starch and salted meat could leave serious gaps. Fresh vegetables, fruits, legumes, fish, and varied fats helped correct those gaps where available. Without them, weakness deepened. A body needs more than bulk. It needs balance. That sounds like a modern lecture until you stand in a cabin and watch a person too tired to finish chewing. Then it sounds like simple reality. You notice one woman cradling a bowl of thin broth and sipping slowly. Her face is drawn. Her eyes look older than the rest of her. Perhaps she's recovering from fever. Perhaps she's newly delivered after childbirth. Perhaps she has worked through sickness because the field did not excuse her. The broth smells of greens and onion with a trace of pork fat floating on top. Not rich, still useful. Warm liquid can go down when a heavy cake cannot. A few soft vegetables can nourish when the stomach rebels. The best household cooks understood that sick bodies often need different food, not merely more food. Children were especially vulnerable to malnutrition and disease. Their bodies were growing while also enduring ration limits, environmental exposure, and the emotional strain of plantation life. A child with a swollen belly might not be well fed at all. That swelling could signal parasites, poor diet, or illness. The cabin world would have recognized the difference between a child who had eaten heartily and a child whose body was behaving strangely. Adults might not know the medical language, but they knew danger when they saw it. Parasites were a constant burden in many plantation environments. Hookworm, roundworm, and other intestinal troubles could sap strength, worsen anemia, and interfere with nutrition even when food was available. Wet soil, inadequate sanitation, and bare feet made transmission easier. That means some enslaved people were fighting a double battle. They lacked enough nourishing food, and their bodies also lost nutrients to illness. You can almost sense the discouragement of that. Eat what you can. Work all day and still feel weak. History can be very rude. Anemia likely affected many, especially women and children, though exact rates are hard to recover. The signs would have been familiar even if the term was not: dizziness on standing, shortness of breath, exhaustion out of proportion to the task, a kind of heaviness in the limbs. Diets low in iron-rich fresh foods could contribute, and so could parasites or repeated childbirth. Here the value of greens, beans, and fish becomes even clearer. They were not culinary decoration. They were part of what kept blood and strength from thinning into danger. Historians still argue over how common specific deficiency diseases were among enslaved populations in different regions, because diagnoses in 19th century records were inconsistent and often careless. Pellagra, for instance, became more clearly recognised later, and not every symptom in earlier records can be mapped neatly onto modern categories. But uncertainty about labels should not hide the broader truth. Many bodies showed signs of chronic nutritional stress. The evidence lies in testimonies, plantation records, medical observations, and the plain logic of the diet itself. You sit near the fire and hear the different sounds of a tired household. A cough that comes from deep in the chest, a spoon clinking weakly against a bowl, the soft rub of a hand over sore calves, a child half asleep and half hungry, someone breathing through a congested nose. These are intimate sounds, and they reveal how closely illness and food live together. Even the smell of the room suggests it. Boiled starch, wet wool, human fatigue, smoke that has settled into blankets and lungs alike. Overwork changed digestion too. People pushed hard in heat often wanted quick-filling food, yet quick-filling food could sit heavy. A dense hoe cake might quiet the stomach for a while, but offer little ease to a person already worn down. Salt pork could provide needed fat and protein, but too much salt could intensify thirst in hot weather. Fresh foods helped, but they were irregular. The body was always negotiating. What can I digest? What can I carry? What will keep me standing tomorrow? There is no romance in that kind of menu planning. One of the quieter health challenges was dental trouble. Coarse meal, age, hard labour, and limited care could wear teeth badly. Missing or painful teeth changed what a person could eat. Soft mush became more important. Bread had to be soaked. Meat had to be cut smaller, or stewed longer. You watch an older woman gum a softened piece of food slowly, while a younger person pretends not to notice the adjustment. This is another way food knowledge kept people going. A household adapted texture to the body available, not the ideal body imagined. Pregnant women faced enormous nutritional pressure. Their bodies needed more iron, more energy, more everything useful, while labour demands often remained severe. Nursing mothers also needed extra food and fluids, though need and supply rarely matched. A baby at the breast draws life from a mother already shorted by the plantation. That is a grim equation, yet households tried to answer it with broths, softened vegetables, fish when possible, sweet potatoes, peas, and every extra bit they could spare. A spoonful of pot liquor might seem small, but to a depleted woman it could be meaningful. There is a curious old pattern in many hard-pressed communities. Certain foods gain reputations as strengthening foods, even when people cannot explain the science. Greens for blood, fish for recovery, broth for the weak, sweet potatoes for gentle fullness. Such beliefs are not always exact, but they often carry practical wisdom inside them. Plantation households likely held many such judgments. A person did not need a medical diploma to notice which meals revived someone and which ones left them no better. You see a man rubbing his lower back after a day's labour. Beside him, another stretches out his fingers one by one, trying to ease the stiffness from them. These gestures remind you that food also supports muscles and joints strained beyond reason. Chronic aches can worsen when the body lacks enough protein and minerals to recover well. Again, the issue is not only starvation, it is the grinding mismatch between what labour extracts and what diet returns. Illness also changed appetite, and that could become dangerous fast. Fever can make food smell wrong. Stomach sickness can make the idea of grease unbearable. A person may need nourishment most when they can least tolerate it. So cooks adjusted. Thinner porridges, clearer broths, small bites more often, herbs to settle the stomach, maybe mint if available, maybe a little rice where rice was known, maybe just warm water with a touch of molasses to coax energy back into a body that refuses solid food. These were practical experiments carried out in cabins, not clinics. A fringe but plausible detail appears in some rural southern recollections. People sometimes judged health by whether a person still wanted a certain favourite taste. If a child who loved sweet potato refused it, alarm rose. If an old man turned away from broth he usually accepted. Someone paid attention. Appetite is a kind of speech, and in close households people learn to hear it. That sensitivity becomes part of survival when a formal medical help is absent or unreliable. The environment itself compounded sickness. Damp quarters encouraged respiratory trouble. Smoke irritated lungs and eyes. Mosquitoes carried disease in some regions. Heat spoiled food quickly. Cold snaps stressed bodies already underfed. Wet feet brought sores. Thin clothing offered little protection. You begin to understand that plantation food was never confronting a single enemy called hunger. It was confronting a whole army. Hunger, yes, but also infection, fatigue, parasites, pregnancy, weather, and relentless work. Even so, people kept building bodily endurance where they could. They sought greens when possible. They used fish and small game to strengthen meals. They saved the best textures for the weakest eaters. They shared broth, softened bread, rendered fat, and every little nutritional advantage they understood. None of this erased the violence of the system. It did, however, reveal how much practical wisdom existed inside the quarters. Health was not a passive condition waiting to happen. It was pursued, defended, and patched together daily. The emotional quality of such care can be quiet to the point of invisibility. No speeches, no noble declarations. Just someone noticing that a child needs the softer bowl. Someone adding hot water to stretch broth for a feverish neighbour. Someone insisting an exhausted mother sit while others handle the pot. Someone saving a fish head because the broth from it may help an elder regain appetite. These actions do not glitter in the archive. They kept people alive anyway. You watch the fire settle and notice how everyone leans toward warmth, toward food, toward any source of restoration. The room is weary but not defeated. A child has finally stopped scratching and fallen asleep. The coughing has eased for the moment. A bowl lies empty in someone's lap, which is as hopeful a sight as any in this place. Bodies remain damaged, strained, uncertain, but they have been answered tonight with what knowledge and care could gather. So you stay in the dim cabin as the smells of greens, broth, smoke, and tired humanity mingle in the warm dark. A hand rests on a fevered forehead. Another rubs sore shoulders with slow patience. Near the hearth, the last of the soft food waits in case someone wakes hungry or weak. In this world of overwork and chronic strain, staying alive means more than filling the stomach. It means reading the body's warnings and meeting them, as best one can, with every useful bite. Night has deepened, and yet the cabin is not silent. The fire has settled into a red pulse, the kind that glows more than it burns, and the room feels wrapped in a low, warm haze of smoke, starch, and worn wood. You sit close enough to hear the small sounds that follow supper. Someone licking a thumb after handling sweet syrup, someone folding cloth over the last cakes, someone humming under the breath without fully meaning to. In this softened hour, food becomes more than survival. It becomes memory you can taste. In a world designed to strip people down to labour alone, the meal still carries old habits, old preferences, old ways of making rough ingredients say something personal. That's the quiet miracle in plantation cooking. Cornmeal may be rationed, pork may be rationed, time may be rationed, even movement may be rationed, but taste is unruly. Technique is stubborn. A person can stir, season, thicken, fry, pound, and combine ingredients in ways that carry echoes from far beyond the plantation, not perfectly preserved, of course. History is never that neat. Yet within the pot, inside the hand, and across the tongue, inherited food knowledge keeps speaking. You notice it first in the preference for one-pot cooking. A single vessel stands over the coals, and into it go greens, peas, onion, fat, scraps of smoked meat, maybe a pepper, perhaps okra if it is in season. The ingredients soften together, share flavour, and become more than a pile of separate parts. This is practical. Yes, one pot saves fuel, effort, and washing. But it is also cultural. Across many West and Central African food traditions, one-pot dishes, thick soups, stews, and grain-based meals have long been central forms of cooking. Under slavery, those traditions did not remain untouched. They bent, adapted, borrowed, and survived in altered forms. Still, the instinct to build a meal through the pot remained powerful. The smell of that pot is layered and deep. Greens turn earthy and soft. Peas give off a mild sweetness. Pork fat rounds the edges. If pepper joins in, the air carries a gentle sting that wakes the nose. Steam beads on the upper lip. The first taste is not sharp or elegant. It is broad, joined, held together. That sense of ingredients becoming one another is part of the memory carried in the meal. Okra offers another clue. Sliced into a stew, it thickens the liquid and gives the dish a silky body that some people love instantly, and others claim to find suspicious until they take a second bite. Its importance in southern black foodways is no accident. Okra travelled with African knowledge and attachment, not merely as a botanical object, but as a familiar food idea. A pot thickened with okra feels substantial in a way thin broth does not. It coats the spoon. It lingers in the mouth. It turns scarcity into texture. That is no small achievement. Rice, where it was available and culturally prominent, carried deep meaning too, on rice plantations especially. The grain was not just a commodity, it was also a food shaped by African expertise from cultivation to cooking. A well-cooked pot of rice demands attention. Too much water and it goes slack. Too little and it hardens. just right, and each grain is tender while still itself. You can imagine someone lifting the lid and letting fragrant steam spill into the room. Smelling softly sweet and clean, rice receives sauce beautifully. It welcomes greens, fish, beans, and gravies. It gives structure to the plate and calm to the stomach. Then there is the matter of pounding and grinding. These actions may seem purely mechanical, but they often preserve rhythm and habit from older worlds. The sound of pestle and mortar, or of grains being worked down into usable form, has deep roots across many food cultures. On plantations, much of the milling system was imposed and industrial, especially for cash crops. Yet within cabin life, the tactile understanding of texture still mattered. How fine should the meal be? How soft should the peas become? How smooth should the mash feel for a child or elder? The hand remains the final judge. You hear a woman mash cooked beans with the back of a spoon, not into a complete paste, but into something halfway between whole and soft. That texture matters. It makes the dish feel fuller. It helps young children eat. It stretches the sense of richness. This sort of adjustment is hard to see in surviving records because it happens in the last inches between pot and bowl. Yet those last inches are where culture often lives. Seasoning practices reveal memory as well. The use of peppers, onions, and smoked elements to wake plain staples speaks to more than hunger. It speaks to expectations of what food should do. It should not merely fill, it should speak. Even a little heat can transform the entire moral character of a meal. A pepper dropped into greens makes the broth feel more alive. Onion cooked in fat before peas are added gives depth that the dish would otherwise lack. Smoked fish or meat creates a savoury background that can make a simple starch feel cherished rather than resigned. There is a sly humour in this too. Plantation food on paper often looks dreary. Plantation food in the hands of skilled cooks could become persuasive, even seductive, within its limits. A pot that smells wonderful can make a poor ration seem almost generous for a few blessed minutes. The ration itself has not improved. The cook has. Human beings have an irritating habit of turning oppression into cuisine when given half a chance. Irritating, that is, if you are the oppressor. Admirable if you possess a nose and a conscience. Historians still argue over exactly how to trace African continuities in enslaved foodways because the Atlantic slave trade pulled people from many regions, and plantation life forced intense mixing with European, indigenous, and local American ingredients. No single line runs cleanly from one village to one cabin, but patterns remain visible. Preferences for greens, legumes, rice, okra, peppers, one-pot cooking, fritters, and thickened dishes all suggest layered continuities rather than random invention. The food became creolized, to use the scholarly term. Though the lived experience was far more intimate than theory usually sounds, you notice that some dishes depend on the art of making starch interesting. Cornmeal by itself can be dull, but shaped and cooked differently it becomes hoe cakes, ash cakes, pone, dumplings, or spoon bread-like mixtures in certain contexts. The transformation of coarse meal into many textures echoes a wider food intelligence found across cultures under pressure. If grain is the base, then craft must provide the variety. Crisp surface, soft centre, smoky crust, fried edge, crumbled mash. Texture becomes flavour's accomplice. Sweetness also carries memory. Molasses, sweet potatoes, roasted corn, ripe fruit when available, all offered ways to soften harshness with sugar. Not refined sugar in the polished dining room sense. Earthier sweetness, darker sweetness. Sweet potatoes roasting near coals send out a smell that is both humble and luxurious, like warm earth deciding to become dessert. A child biting into one would know immediately that this was a different category of comfort from plain mush. The body relaxes around sweetness, the mind does too, for a moment. There are also dishes born from scraps and ingenuity that later generations would recognise as beloved foods. Bits of cornmeal fried crisp, greens cooked long with smoked flavour, beans enriched with whatever meat could be spared, rice dishes layered with fish or vegetables. These foods would eventually help shape regional southern cuisine in profound ways. Though in 1840 they lived in the quarters under conditions of coercion and deprivation. It is important not to romanticise that origin. Delicious food can emerge from terrible systems. The deliciousness does not excuse the terror. It does, however, testify to the genius of the people doing the cooking. A curious detail from 19th century food recollections is how often people remembered particular smells rather than formal recipes. The smell of rice steaming, the smell of greens with pork, the smell of ash cake from the hearth. That makes sense. Recipes require paper, leisure, and standardization. Smell belongs to the body. It is learned in company. It tells you that home, however fragile, exists somewhere nearby, in a cabin after dark. The aroma of familiar preparation could do emotional work beyond nutrition. You catch that emotional work in the way people react when a certain dish appears. A face softens at the sight of greens. Someone leans in when pepper hits hot fat. A child brightens at the smell of sweet potato. No speeches follow. None are needed. Preference itself is a form of identity. To like food a certain way is to declare that you are more than a labouring body. You're a person with taste, memory, and standards. Even standards modest enough to include the sentence, "This stew needs more onion," still count. The meal also carries language without words. A woman pinches dough thinner because that is how she prefers it. An elder insists peas should break down more. Someone likes fish fried harder. Someone likes the pot liquor saved. Someone dislikes too much smoke on the meat. These preferences create household style. Household style becomes community style. Community style becomes a lineage of taste. The archive rarely records such things neatly, but the tongue surely did. African foodways also shaped how ingredients were socially understood. Greens were not garnish. They were central. Peas were not side decoration. They were substantial. The pot was not secondary to the roast. It was often the heart of the meal. In elite European dining traditions of the same period, prestige might gather around large cuts of meat, formal service, and differentiation of courses. In the quarters, prestige looked different. Depth of flavour, skillful stretching, proper texture, a pot that fed many and satisfied them as much as circumstances allowed. That is a different culinary philosophy, and it proved enduring. You see a woman use the last of a pepper with clear intention, scraping every bit into the food. Heat matters in more ways than one. It stimulates appetite. It creates excitement in a monotonous diet. It makes the meal feel awake. Many African and African diasporic cuisines value this lively relationship between spice and appetite. In a place where people are often too tired for much else, a lively mouthful can be oddly restorative. Music drifts into the room now, not as full song, but as a hum and a tapping hand on a knee. The rhythm joins the domestic sounds. Spoon, breath, fire, hum. The sensory world blends together until cooking, eating, and remembering seem inseparable. A child dozes with the smell of greens in the hair. An elder speaks softly about how to tell when rice is done by listening to the pot rather than staring at it. That advice is half technique, half inheritance. Inheritance is the true subject here. Not inheritance of property, which slavery denied, but inheritance of method, how to season, how to thicken, how to fry, how to use leaves, grains, fish, and roots, how to make a meal feel like itself. Such knowledge moves hand to hand, mouth to mouth, without paperwork. It survives because people perform it repeatedly under pressure. The pressure may distort it. The repetition keeps it alive. So you remain in the warm, dim cabin while the coals pulse low and the last steam lifts from the pot. The room smells of peppers, greens, grain, and smoke, rich with the kind of memory that cannot be measured in ledgers. In each bowl, the rationed ingredients of plantation life have been answered by older instincts, adapted tastes, and stubborn culinary intelligence, turning bare necessity into food that still carries the flavour of a people remembering themselves. The plantation grows quiet in the way hard places do, never fully at rest, only less loud. You step outside into the late hour and feel the night air cool against skin that has carried smoke, heat, sweat, and labour all day. The cabins stand in a dim row under a sky brushed with thin stars. Somewhere nearby, a dog shifts in its sleep. Somewhere farther off, an owl gives a low call from the trees. The smell of banked fires lingers in the yard, mixed with clay, damp grass, and the faint savoury memory of supper now mostly eaten. At this hour, the truth settles plainly. Every meal here has been more than food. It has been planning, bargaining, improvising, remembering, hiding, sharing, preserving, and enduring. You begin to see the full shape of that endurance when the noise falls away. During daylight, survival can look like motion. People walking, digging, stirring, carrying, catching, cutting. At night, survival reveals its deeper form. It is thought, calculation. The quiet mental work of deciding how long a sack will last. Who needs the softer bowl? Whether a fish should be smoked or eaten now? Whether greens can be stretched into broth by morning? Whether a child's appetite means health or fever coming on? Hunger sharpens thought into something almost architectural. A household builds tomorrow from scraps. The body is at the centre of every decision, not the abstract body of plantation records, measured as output and cost, but the real body with sore feet, cramped hands, nursing breasts, aging teeth, swollen joints, and sudden cravings that say more than words. Food answers the body imperfectly, but always with intention. A little grease for strength, soft mash for the old, hot broth for the sick, something sweet when it can be spared. Not because sweetness is essential in a cold calculation, but because the spirit also frays under sameness. Survival is never only mechanical. Even in brutal systems, people need taste, comfort, and little signs that life is still human. There is a cruel contradiction in plantation food. The system tried to maintain labour while denying care. It issued enough to extract work, but rarely enough to create ease. It relied on human bodies while refusing them fullness. It forced dependence while often leaving people to solve the daily problem of actual nourishment through gardens, traps, foraging, and domestic ingenuity. That contradiction sits everywhere in the food world. The ration says control. The added greens say correction. The smoked fish says foresight. The shared bowl says community. The whole table, if such a narrow arrangement can even be called a table, becomes a record of resistance to neglect. Resistance here is often quiet enough to escape dramatic language. No banners, no proclamations, yet the acts remain real. Saving seed is resistance to imposed scarcity. Flavouring the pot well is resistance to dehumanization. Feeding a weak neighbour is resistance to the plantation's attempt to reduce life to labour units. Preserving fish for later is resistance to the uncertainty built into the system. Keeping culinary preferences alive is resistance too, because preference insists on personhood. Even the decision to make food taste good, when every condition argues for mere fuel, holds a kind of moral defiance. You can sense that defiance in the atmosphere of the quarters at night. The air is cooler now, but it still carries the trapped warmth of day from the wood and packed earth. A drifting ribbon of smoke slips from one chimney and curls upward. Through a doorway you catch the touch of firelight on a pot left near the coals, not abandoned, only waiting. The smell is thin now but still present. Grain, greens, ash, salt. The ordinary sacred smells of continuance. They seem almost to say that the day has not defeated everyone. Not entirely. Historians still argue over how to measure survival under slavery without reducing it to mere biological persistence. That debate matters. To stay alive is not only to avoid death, it is also to maintain family ties, bodily knowledge, shared habits, emotional texture, and cultural pattern under relentless pressure. Food sits at the heart of that larger survival. It feeds the muscles, yes. It also feeds memory, mutual obligation, and the practical intelligence that helps a community remain itself. A bowl can carry more than calories. It can carry a worldview in softened form. You notice how many layers of knowledge have gathered in even the simplest meal. Agricultural knowledge in the garden row, ecological knowledge in the creek trap, botanical knowledge in the foraged greens, thermal knowledge at the hearth, medical knowledge in the broth for the sick, social knowledge in how portions are assigned, cultural knowledge in texture, seasoning, and method. None of these are accidental, none are trivial. Together they create a food system within a food system, one official and controlling, the other adaptive and human. A strange thing happens when you look closely at such labour. What first seems desperate begins to reveal sophistication. Not luxury, certainly, never comfort in the easy sense, but sophistication of observation, timing, and use, to know when a sweet potato will keep and when it will spoil, to understand which greens revive appetite, to save the right amount of fat for later, to make cornmeal take several forms, to judge a fire by heat on the hand and sound in the pot. This is culinary skill. Nutritional skill, household management, and environmental literacy all braided together. History has often been too proud of grand men in fine coats and not proud enough of this. There were limits, of course, and they must not be softened. People went hungry. People grew weak. People got sick in ways food wisdom could not repair. Children suffered. Mothers suffered. Elders suffered. Some seasons were worse than others. Some plantations harsher. Some years thinner. Skill did not erase cruelty. Community did not dissolve coercion. Ingenuity did not end malnutrition. These facts must remain clear, because admiration for endurance should never become an excuse for what made endurance necessary. And yet endurance itself deserves careful regard. Not sentimental praise, not decorative admiration, but real respect. It took discipline to survive on plantation food in 1840. Discipline in portioning, discipline in hiding reserves from waste, discipline in labouring again after labour to garden, fish, gather, preserve, and cook. Discipline in reading bodies and seasons and supplies. Discipline in not consuming everything at once when hunger urged exactly that. Every small reserve, every warmed leftover, every dried bean, every shared cake spoke of minds trained by pressure and sharpened by necessity. There is also an emotional endurance that food helped sustain. A person offered a hot bowl after exhaustion receives more than nourishment. A child given a sweet bite feels more than sugar. An elder handed softened bread receives more than texture. These gestures tell the body it still matters to someone. That matters profoundly in a system designed to deny the interior life of the enslaved. Food care says, I see your need. I know your preference. I kept this for you. Such statements, even when made without words, uphold the social world inside the quarters. One little quirky truth about hard times is that people often remember the exact foods associated with survival more vividly than the speeches of powerful men. A person may forget the wording of a law, but not the smell of fish smoking in damp weather, or the feel of warm hoe cake in the palm before dawn labour. Memory clings to sensation. That is why the food history of slavery remains so powerful. It is not abstract. It is textured, aromatic, greasy, smoky, bitter, sweet, and painfully specific. The plantation night around you feels full of those specifics. Dry weeds whisper at the fence line. A loose shutter taps once in a breeze. The ground still holds some warmth from the day, though dew begins to gather on the grass. From inside one cabin comes the soft sound of someone scraping the pot clean, not because there is much left, but because what remains is worth having. From another comes a cough, then silence. Over everything rests a patience born of repetition. Morning will ask for strength again. The body must be made ready as best it can, and readiness is perhaps the best word for what these food practices achieved. Not abundance, not security in the comfortable sense. Readiness, a readiness built from practiced scarcity, a body fueled enough to rise, a child steadied enough to make it through another day, a mother given enough broth to continue, a reserve of smoked fish for a lean moment, a basket of roots gathered when chance allowed, a pot seasoned so well that even poor ingredients encouraged eating rather than refusal. Survival depended on maintaining the threshold. The narrow but crucial line below which collapse became much more likely. You can also feel how food linked land to body in ways the plantation could never fully own. The plantation claimed the field, yet the creek still offered fish to those who knew it. The woods still yielded berries and roots to the observant. Small garden plots still answered skilled hands. The hearth still transformed what was gathered. In that sense, staying alive depended partly on refusing to let the world be defined only by the plantation's intentions. The official ration was one story. The actual meal was a larger one. As the hour grows later, the cabins settle deeper into stillness. A baby gives one sleepy cry and then quiets. The fire in one hearth sinks into a softer red. The scent of cooled ashes becomes stronger than the scent of food. You stand in the yard and understand that the people here remained alive not because the system protected them, but because they protected one another and learned every available language of the nourishment. The language of corn and pork, the language of greens and peas, the language of fish and roots, the language of smoke, salt, patience and shared portions, the language of bodies watched closely and answered carefully. That is the real story carried in the night air. Not just hunger, though hunger is never far away. Not just suffering, though suffering is woven through everything. The deeper story is expertise under pressure, community under strain, taste under coercion, planning under uncertainty. The refusal to let a human life become nothing but appetite managed by someone else. Each meal, however plain, held a small declaration. We are still here. We know how to feed one another. We know how to take what little is available and keep life moving inside it. Now the wind down begins, and the plantation night softens around you. The stars above the cabins seem a little steadier, and the sounds grow fewer, farther apart, easier to follow. You breathe in the last traces of smoke and warm grain drifting from the chimneys, and they no longer feel harsh, only faint and familiar. The ground beneath your feet has cooled. Dew settles on the grass in tiny silver beads. Somewhere in the dark, water moves quietly through reeds, and leaves stir with the slow confidence of trees that have watched many seasons pass. You let the images loosen gently now. The iron pot by the hearth, the bowl warming cold hands, the garden leaves dark with evening, the basket of roots and berries, the fish drying in smoke, the careful hand dividing one last cake. All of it begins to blur at the edges, not into forgetfulness, but into calm. The people in these cabins sleep when they can, close to banked coals and the smell of ash, carrying into rest the practical wisdom that guarded them through another day. And as the night deepens, the food itself seems to settle into silence. No more sizzling fat, no more spoons against bowls, only the memory of flavour lingering softly in the air. Salt, greens, corn, smoke, a little sweetness where fortune allowed. The body easing at last into stillness, the yard resting, the trees standing watch, the whole scene fading into darkness that feels gentler now, quieter now, until there is nothing left to do but let the night hold it all, and let yourself drift with it into sleep.